Today's topic is podcast. But before discussing the podcast, we should know that what amount of podcast you should listen, what kind of exact process you should follow in order to have real benefits of podcast, because there are over 2 million podcasts out there in the world, and to listen every podcast it's next to impossible. So what are the benefits of podcast, what amount of time you should give to each and every podcast, it's necessary for you to know. First of all, dear audience, why podcasts are necessary? Podcasts are necessary for you because they increase your comprehension skills, they boost your confidence, they build your fluency, and they give you cultural insights. You know about the culture, traditions, way of living, each and everything through podcasts. Now comes the process. What exact process you should follow to reap the real benefits of podcasts? Because you should not be as a viewer. You should not treat yourself as a viewer or as a listener, passive listener. You should not only simply listening the podcast, because out of all your ears what you are doing, you are just simply listening each and everything, whether they are stories, whether they are postcards, whether they are blog posts, whether they are the different kind of videos in English. You are just listening, but still you are not fluent. It means that there is something wrong with the process. There is something wrong with the methodology which you are adopting while listening, while watching all these things. Because you are just assuming yourself as a passive listener, as a simple viewer. That's why you are not indulging yourself, you are not immersing yourself, you are not engrossing yourself in the whole process. You are not assuming yourself as one of those characters in the podcast, in the videos. That's why you are just assuming yourself as a separate entity, as a separate personality. That's why you have detached yourself, you have separated yourself from the process. The very first thing, first of all, you should have to assume one of the character in the podcast. Why? Because the indulgence is very much necessary. After listening every podcast, what you should have to do, you have to narrate each and everything. You have to assume as a narrator, you have to assume as a newscaster, you have to assume yourself as a one of the characters and narrate the story, narrate the podcast in your own words. Because if you don't do this, you can't get the maximum benefit out of podcast. Because studying grammar, studying language, studying vocabulary is a separate entity. You have to absorb yourself, you have to absorb vocabulary, because we are not studying, we are not listening the vocabulary only, we are listening the vocabulary in context, listening the expressions, listening the idioms in context. So you are actually absorbing the language, and it's not sufficient, my dear English learners. It's not sufficient to just absorb the language. You have to speak out the language. After absorbing each and everything, what next level? The next level is to speak out. Next level is to practice. If you don't do your practice, if you don't do your speaking skills out, how can you be a fluent, a confident English speaker? If you are not following this process, simple listening, simple viewing anything can't satisfy your requirement of becoming fluent English speaker. That's harsh reality. Number one is that practice is key. You have to do your practice. And number two thing is that simple absorbing of language is not sufficient. You have to speak out. You have to do your part. You have to do your output. Only input is not necessary. You have to do your output in the form of speaking. After every podcast, what you have to do, you have to practice. You have to do your narrative task. And what is your narrative task? You have to assume the role of a narrator and narrate the podcast in your own words, in the same style, and repeating and absorbing the same vocabulary and expressions and idioms which are used in the podcast. Now there are over 2 million podcasts in the world, and it's very difficult. And when you are a beginner, how can you do? You can't listen the difficult, the complicated and philosophical podcast. Why? Because you are improving your listening skills, your comprehension skills. And if you are beginning with very difficult, complicated philosophical podcast, it will be very difficult for you to comprehend, and your interest will not be developed. So the very first thing you have to keep in mind that you should start with stories podcast. Yes, stories podcast in English. They are for bedtime, car rides, and for all ages. They are engaging, and stories just create imagination in your minds, critical thinking in your mind. And the best part of stories podcast in English is that they are engaging, they are inspirational, and you don't lose your interest. They are very fascinating. They take you to the fairy tales like Snow White, to complex level like Peter Rabbit. So whenever you are in a fantasy, whenever you are in a fairy tale, when you are engrossed in the story, you don't lose your interest. So the very first podcast I recommend here is that you should follow story podcast. First of all, stories podcast are the best podcast for you. The second very interesting podcast is English learning for curious minds. As you know from the very title, curious mind, it's about the minds who want to know. So these are about science, philosophy, history, and they are about the world. Fascinating stories. You want to learn about the whole world. Fascinating facts. So go and satisfy your curiosity. It will arouse your curiosity, because when you are doing something novel, something curious, you will be more interested. You want to know about the world, the curious facts about the words which you have not known in your whole history. So the very first thing you have to do is stories podcast, to imagine and to fertile your imagination and feed your mind with different kind of stories. The second podcast is English learning for curious minds. When curious minds, you will know about the fantastic facts about the world, and you will not lose your interest. And when you do not lose your interest, your comprehension skills will develop, and in this way you are learning language with novelty, with a novel way. The third podcast is Joe Rogan Experience. Joe Rogan is a comedian, and he delivers you English in a comedy, humorous, because it's difficult for a non-native speaker to understand the humorous, the comedy, the humor and jokes of the language. So it's the best platform to understand. And last thing which you have to do your practice on the daily basis. It doesn't mean that if you are not understanding, if you are not comprehending the language, you should give up to listening the podcast. No, not at all, dear audience. What you have to do, you have to listen on daily basis, on regular basis, because with practice you will understand, you will expand your vocabulary, you will absorb the language, and when you will absorb the language will come out of your mouth automatically and naturally, and you are building your confidence. You are boosting your fluency level. So these podcasts, when you will take interest, and let me know in the comment section if you want to know about more interesting podcast, and I will make another video for you. So till the next video, stay happy, stay blessed. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.